All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Negative Space panel. Um, let's see, what announcements do I have this time? Actually, I'm very excited about this announcement. We have our short comics competition opening next Monday, July 10th. We're accepting, I think, 4 to 8 page, not I think I know, 4 to 8 page short comics, finished comics. It's open for about 2 months. So check out our page. We'll start announcing the judges for that one this week. So don't miss out. That's a great one. And all the finalists get put into a digital anthology. It's a great way to showcase your work. Um, and then, yeah, that's actually the only one because I don't want to announce the judges yet because those are going to be coming out on social media and our newsletter this week. So, enough of me. I'll just bring Josh into it. Let him take over and do his thing like he usually does. Thank you
Thank
again, as
you,
always.
Noah.
Enjoy.
All right. So the two announcements I always make, very simple. If you've missed any episodes, you can check them all out on any major podcasting platform, Negative Space Comics, or on YouTube. And you can find out about future events at negativespace.com negativespacecomics.com/events. And you can also, if you have any questions, you can ask them in the Q&A of the Zoom dashboard. And enough of that. Let's get into the conversation for today. So today we're talking about retellings and adopting classics, adapting anything into a modern audience. So let's meet our guests. First up, we have Jeremy Holt, who is a non-binary author whose works include Gatsby, Made in Korea, Virtually Yours, Before Houdini, After Houdini, and Skip to the End. Hello, Jeremy. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. And our second guest, Ayize Jama-Everett, is a writer of speculative fiction, as well as the graphic novels Box of Bones and The Last Count of Monte Cristo. Hello, Ayize.
Hello, Josh. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you both for being here. We are going to start with the question we always start with, which is creative origin story. What made you want to tell stories in the first place? So, Jeremy, we'll start with you.
I think it was out of a mode of desperation. Um, I was working retail. I was working as a genius at the Apple Store in New York City back in 2008, and I was barely making enough for rent. And it got to the point where I was so broke, I just couldn't leave my apartment. And so, to pass the time, I decided to try to write something that I'd been thinking about for a while. So I embarked on writing a zombie comic, which I thought was so original at the time. And it was also the time that I was actually getting into reading comics and realizing what people were into. And so, yeah, it was basically what started out as like a 6 week exercise sort of ballooned into a 6 month obsession. And then I just never stopped.
Hmm. I love that. And I want to get back to the comics connection too, as well. But Ayize, what about you? What made you want to tell stories?
I don't know. It's kind of like the beginning of Goodfellas, or like all my life I wanted to be a gangster. It's like all my life I just wanted to. I wanted all my life I wanted to have a Chris Claremont run on a comic like X-Men back in the 80s. I grew up reading comics. I was going to get left back in the second grade when I was a kid. They said the words that they used at the time was retarded. They said I was retarded because I couldn't read. Turns out I had dyslexia, and my uncle was like, he can read. He just threw me a bunch of comic books, and he said, I'll buy you more if you tell me what each one is about. Bam, 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 bam. And literally have not stopped reading comics. I had like a 3 year gap where I stopped reading comics in college because I was like, that's not cool. And then Sandman came out, and I was like, shut up, this is the coolest thing ever. So I've just been that's just what I've been done my entire life, reading and writing.
I love that. So I want to touch on what got you into writing comics. I feel like it's a transition not everyone makes of reading comics and then deciding to write them as well. So I want to start with you. When did you start writing comics and what were your early attempts like?
Oh my god, they sucked. They were so bad. My early attempts were, I was 9, 10, 11 years old, and I was writing like scripts basically with no panel descriptions, anything like that. And it was weird. Like no one else could read it. And then somehow, I can't remember when it was, but I got a hold of an infamous Alan Moore Swamp Thing script, which was like 90 pages. No, it was like 112 pages for like 34. And I was like, I can't do this. I'm not that good. And so I went to writing novels, and working on my craft, and understanding the whole thing. And was fortunate enough to self-publish my first one, and then it got picked up by a major publisher, and that was good. But I used to work in a comic book store. I knew the guys at Image back when they were in Berkeley, and I was always had a foot in the comic world. And then my friend John Jennings was like, hey, we should do something together. And John's kind of like a let's just put it together and go kind of guy. And I was like, bet. And so we did, I don't know if it's too early to plug or not, but we did, oops, can't even see it with nothing. Box of Bones. There you go, whatever. Nice comic called Box of Bones. I like it. And John has an imprint over at Abrams. And so then he was like, hey, what do you think about doing the Count of Monte Cristo? The Count of Monte Cristo in outer space. And I was like, outer space is lame. And he was like, what do you mean? I'm like, it just abdicates all like the problems of today. And like, I don't know, I was just on this tear where I watched Star Trek, but I didn't realize that like nobody in Star Trek, like in that world, needs a job. Did you know that? Like it's just like socialist utopia where like nobody has to work. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't make any sense. Like that's, you disconnect from like the reality of humanity right there when no one has to work for survival. Like I don't get that. So I was like, outer space is boring, but I'm really curious about what the Earth looks like 300 years from now or 200 years from now with like climate change and all that in positions of power. And he's like, yeah, bet. So that's what we ended up working on.
And I want to get back to a lot of what you said there, but I want to hear, Jeremy, what made you get into comics and your early forays into that medium?
It started when I started reading them. I'm a late bloomer. I didn't start reading comics until around 2007. So I was with my oldest brother at the time. I was visiting him in Connecticut. He's a doctor now, family, kids, all that. But he did collect comics as a kid. And I remember peeking through some of them. And I distinctly remember reading one of Jim Lee's run on the X-Men. I distinctly remember Wolverine and Jubilee's relationship, which I thought was really cool. But I didn't really keep up with it. So it wasn't until I saw him in 2007 and he's like, hey, I got some time. Let's go to a coffee shop. Do you want to read some comics? I was like, sure. And he gave me Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns. And I was very impressed with it. I was surprised with how grounded it felt. And I said to him, I was like, whoa, is this where comic books are? And he's like, that's like 20 years old. Like, oh. So then I went to my local comic book shop in Union Square and I was just like, what are people reading? And when I was sort of led into the world of Vertigo Comics, it was Brian K. Vaughan and Peter Guerra's Why the Last Man that convinced me to try to start writing my own.
And then before we get into Gatsby and Last Count of Monte Cristo, I want to ask, because we often talk about this concept of breaking into the industry and what it takes to sort of get a foothold in it. So I'm curious to hear from both of you about what your experience was. Most of the time when I ask this, the creators say, there was no moment. It was sort of like a gradual effort, or they feel like they don't even know if it ever happened. So I'm curious, Jeremy, I want to start with you. This notion of breaking in, do you feel like there was a project that really sort of broke you into the writing industry?
It wasn't a project per se. It was the singular goal of wanting to get published by Image. Like I just was like, I need to get published by Image and that's it. If I get one book in, I can die happy. And it took 12 years. I mean, I quit multiple times along the way. I had so many rejections. I still get rejections. And now it's just, once you're on the other side of it and you start to get some publishing success, with the way things move in publishing, by the time it comes out, you're already working on something else. So it wasn't really what I thought it was going to be. And when I finally did get a series in an Image, it happened to be during the pandemic. So I didn't get to do the things that I'd seen all my friends before me get to do, just go to the convention, sit behind the massive Image booth, be on podcasts. And it was all kind of, I felt sequestered in a way. So for me, it was really just that singular goal. And also that I decided from day one that I didn't want to do the self-publishing route. So I just was going to just try to get published by someone else. And what I learned along the way was that it's important to have goals, but it's really more important to be able to move those goalposts. So it took me about, I don't know, maybe 6 years in to realize that just because I had a day job that did not detract from my writing, it did not mean that I wasn't a good enough writer. In fact, it allowed me to be free with my creativity. And once I realized that, my love for the medium, my love for the process, allowed me to just keep going, because really the only thing you cannot do is quit. If you quit, then it's over.
Very true. Ayize, what about you? Was there a breaking in moment?
I feel like I'm still breaking in. Like I don't, like again, until I have my Chris Claremont years run on X-Men, I'm still trying to break in. But I really appreciate what you said, Jeremy. I always feel like I'm a hard ass when folks are like, well, what do you, how do you do it? And I'm like, don't quit. And people are like, no, there's got to be more than that. I'm like, actually, no. I'm like, there's people that I
I
feel
mean, like to that, like for me, when it came to image, it's like I would ask people, friends who got in, I was like, what'd you do? And they'd tell me what they did. And they said, try it. And I didn't work. So the way I got in was specifically a way that I'd never heard worked. It worked for me, but it's like once that portal opens, it closes behind you. And I couldn't say, hey, new person, do this, it'll get you in, because there's no guarantee.
Yeah. So I mean, I just think it's really important advice, and I also like what you said about having a day job. Like, saved my life when someone was like, "Real writers have day jobs," and I was like, "Okay, cool. I can, I can not feel like shit every time something gets rejected." I say real writers get rejected from things they haven't applied to yet. You know what I mean? Like, it's this constant process of putting yourself out there, not being precious with your work, like not taking it personally. Like every no is a maybe. I know that sounds kind of weird, but only in terms of writing. Like like as much as possible, you just want to, okay, no, that we didn't like this, cool, can you tell me what you might like? Like, all right, well, if
I
this.
agree with the no being a maybe. I agree with that, because I heard from an editor years ago that said when she would reply to submissions directly, and reject, it was a rejection, but she said the ones that I decided to write to those creators, I would save their pitch in a separate folder, and that was my to look out for folder. And if you make it in that folder, I'm waiting for the next thing from you. And it's really what happened at Image, was that I kept pitching and I kept hearing, you're this close, you're this close. And I was like, I don't know what that means. And you just got to keep doing it. Yeah.
It's interesting because the guest we had on 2 weeks ago, Dina Mohammed, she actually got a no from an editor, but didn't agree why they said no, and responded and said, here are all the reasons you're wrong. And they came back with an offer, which I'd never heard of anything like that before. But I was like, you just became a hero. Like, first off, nobody responds to editors in that way. And second off, it worked. So yeah, I like that no's or maybes. Like they aren't dead ends. So awesome. So let's move on to talking about both of your adaptations, Gatsby and Last Count of Monte Cristo. So let's just start with why you chose these stories. Ayize, you made it sound like it was sort of just like somebody mentioned it, like let's do it in space, and you were like, no, but I feel like there's a deeper connection than that. So why the Count of Monte Cristo?
So Count of Monte Cristo, I think, was the first book that I finished. Like that I finished reading it in its entirety. And even then, if you've ever actually seen the actual full thing, it's like 800, 900 pages. So it wasn't that. It was like the Penguin edition, 280 page, whatever. But I remember being so thrilled that I finished it, because I was pretty young. And then to read it, I mean, it is the beginning in my mind of like the superhero genre, right? It is literally the tale of someone wrongly imprisoned by people who thought he was his friends. He goes into hell. He finds a mentor who trains him to be the most badass individual on the planet. And then he comes out and he's like, one word, revenge. I'm taking everybody. I am not just vengeance. I am the Lord's vengeance. And I'm like, yeah, like Batman, you've got nothing on this dude. Like, I'm sorry. Like, this dude is just murdering folks left and right because he feels he is owed this, right? And then there's this transformation that happens for him later in the book. So the story's been close to my heart since I was a kid. And then I can't remember, a few years ago, I should probably look this up before it came on here. This book called The Black Count came out. And it was about Alexander Dumas' father. And one thing that I realized, like, Jamal was a quarter. He had African descent in him. Basically, his father was half black, grew up in sort of Martinique area, came over to France. He was a general in Napoleon's army, basically. Like, he was like on par with Napoleon, would like fight with him. All the stories that we read, that Man in the Iron Mask, Three Musketeers, Count of Monte Cristo, they're all based on this guy's father, right? And there's this like erasure of blackness that kind of happened through these tellings. And I was like, well, what would happen if we brought blackness in the same way that it was destroyed, right? Which is not like, screw all you darkies, right? It's not that. It's just like shifting location, right? Like getting all white actors or all white presentation, and that'll be it. So I shifted location to Africa, right? And I was like, okay, there we go. And the politics of Africa, and also the politics of India, in terms of working with the here they're known as the untouchable caste, and like what that looks like, what's the role of blackness in all of this. I figured that would be really good and important stuff to play with. So that was kind of how I got to, like, John mentioned the Count, and I was like, I've had this story in my head about the Count for a good 15 years, like, easily. So I was just like, okay, let's just put this down on paper.
What about you, Jeremy? Why Gatsby?
I also came to it very late. I read it in 2017. It was on a list of books I was trying to read. I was trying to get through 50 novels in a year. I only made it to about 33. And I was working on a completely different project at the time. I was actually outlining and interviewing former criminal profilers at the FBI for a serial killer book I was designing. And so I was deep into that. And then I read Gatsby, and I was alarmed with how relevant some of the major themes felt to me, having not read it ever before. And I immediately wanted to do a young adult version of it. And that had more interest to me than the last 18 months of this other project I was working on. So I just shelved the other, a young adult prose novel initially, which wasn't very good. I can freely admit that. But it got sort of the broad strokes out. I just had a rough sketch of it in my mind. And then when I decided to adapt it into a graphic novel, I decided to lean into of a more modern retelling of it, younger cast, diverse cast, queer cast. And the two themes that stuck out to me was the power of reinvention, which was hard to kind of consider because I wasn't sure if a Gatsby character could exist in the digital age. And once I realized it was possible, it sort of gave me the permission to continue working on it. And the other was the American Dream. So having those in the context of the 2020s, I thought was very interesting. And again, to the power of reinvention, it immediately reminded me of advice my mother gave me growing up. I moved a lot. I lived in 5 different countries before I was 18. So every time I'd move, my mom would say to me, "This is the time to reinvent yourself. You can be whoever you want to be." And I never had the courage to actually take her up on that advice, but it has always stuck with me. And so I realized I not only wanted this Gatsby character to go through the reinvention that he goes through, that everybody's fully aware of, but because of the age of the internet and because of social media, I also wanted to explore the rest of the cast of characters who can also reinvent themselves through social media.
Both fascinating stories, and you answered. I was going to ask both of you about the elements that you wanted to bring from the original source material, which you both more or less answered. So I'm curious, on the opposite, was there anything? Because I mean, these are both sizable books that wouldn't necessarily be easy to fit into a graphic novel, which is a shorter story. So I'm curious which elements, and we'll get more into also as well how much you adapted it directly and how much of it you just built from a foundation of the story. But I'm curious if there were any particular things in the story that you left behind that you didn't incorporate into your retelling. So Jeremy, let's start with you.
I was able to get rid of and just ignore the style of the 20s. Obviously, it's not relevant. The green light was a big thing that I wanted to try to keep, but ultimately couldn't figure out how it works. And the challenge that I created for myself sort of by accident not really thinking it through when I de-aged the characters and made them teenagers, was that the relationships to each other had to change. So like a prime example is the George and Myrtle Wilson characters are a married couple, and I made them brother and sister. I also changed the occupation of the George Wilson character from a gas station attendant to a member of a very threatening um, gang known as MS-13, El Salvadorian gang, that actually does have a stronghold in Long Island right now. So those kind of wrote me into these little corners, which was kind of interesting. What I did take from the book was that there were major plot points that I had to hit for it to feel like Gatsby. But because of the difference in characters, how I got to those points was the challenge. And I will admit that 2/3 of the way through, I wasn't sure I could finish it. I was like, I think I've written myself off the road. And it took a solid 6 weeks of writing, throwing out, writing, throwing out, writing, throwing out to finally figure it out.
Interesting. Ayize, what about you? Anything in particular you left behind, didn't bring into your retelling?
The Napoleonic Wars feature prominently in the Count of Monte Cristo, and I still don't understand all of them. Like I don't get how many times Napoleon was emperor and then not, and then kind of, and then took Africa, and then it was just too much, and so I had to come up with some other sort of, because those wars feature like off screen for the Count of Monte Cristo. So I was like, okay, what other major conflict could be going on, 200 years in the future that would affect Africa? And so that's where I came up with the whole, this notion of like the untouchables in India having a revolt, and half of a United African Congress sort of siding with them, and then half of them just being like, we're not involved, and just what are the political implications of that. So I kind of left the Napoleonic Wars behind. There are these like Jama actually did these really weird things where he would take current news articles of the day, because this is written in Syria, right? It was published, I think, every week. And he would fictionalize details of these bandits roaming through Catalonia, Spain, whatever. And he put it in the novel, and then the character would have like maybe one scene with the rest of the characters, and then they would disappear forever, which is why the book is like freaking 800 pages long. And I was just like, there's no time and need for that. So kind of bounce that stuff out. There's some, there's some sexist stuff in there as to like the ability of women and what women can and can't tolerate. And so I had to jettison that because it was just dumb. And then just did a little gender play. There's some gender swap and some gender play with some of the main characters as well. Just because, I don't know, I wanted it to be relevant and like, just not so heteronormative. Yeah.
Sure. And then you both kind of got to this, but I'm anytime you're retelling something, I feel like there's that impulse to tell it as true as you can. And if you struggled with that, or how you were able to allow yourself to take liberties, to make changes to the story, Ayize?
It was simple. I just read every other freaking version. I like looked at like the, classics illustrated versions of the Count of Monte Cristo. I watched, I think, 4 different movie versions. There's an anime version that I watched. Yeah, it was just like there were so many different ways, and I was like, it totally gave me that. It gave me that permission to be like, okay, well, people are gonna pull what they want from this to make a cohesive narrative, and so let's just do that. It was a lot more fun.
I like that. And Jeremy, you'd already mentioned writing yourself into a corner, so you kind of almost had to take those liberties. But were there did you struggle at all with deviating from the source material?
No, I mean, as long as I was hitting those narrative points, I sort of got the permission indirectly from Fitzgerald's great granddaughter, who was interviewed a couple of years ago when the book went into the public domain, and she was directly asked, "What do you hope to see people do with this now that it's available?" And she said, "I would like to see a modern, diverse retelling of it." And I thought, that's exactly what I'm doing. And because the book is, I've sort of couched it inside of a police procedural. because there's the crime component, both of what Gatsby is doing for work as well as his own demise, that never really gets explored. And it's something that I thought would make for a fresh retelling in a modern era where people love true crime, people love understanding, how someone might get away with something. And also my unabashed love for teen dramas like Gossip Girl, The OC, Dawson's Creek. So it's like I wanted to sort of write my version of that using these familiar characters. And, when I mentioned to close friends about what I was working on, everybody was asking me, well, do you know that Nick is in love with Gatsby? And I was like, I really don't believe that. I've read this book 4 times. I've not seen it directly. I think it's a stretch just because he finds them interesting. But I decided to go like headfirst into that gay conspiracy and just make it overtly gay. Because I think that is a more attuned version of the story that I think makes more sense to a modern audience.
And I want to touch on theme because you both mentioned this as well. These aren't just retellings. There are a lot of modern themes. And Jeremy, you'd mentioned yours sort of lent itself to modern themes already. And Ayize, there's that theme of climate and the state of the planet and all that stuff. So I'm curious when you started engaging with those themes, if that was something you set out to build the story around, or if it just sort of worked its way into your story and you're like, oh, cool, like this is another modern element to have in it. So Jeremy, start with you. How actively were you engaging with these themes that you wanted the story to have?
They fit into place pretty seamlessly. I mean, especially when you take the idea of reinvention and you take the idea of the advent of the internet, proliferations of online accounts, how curated something like Instagram can make somebody or make one's lifestyle. And so all of these things felt like an extension of the book, just progressed 100 years. And so it really wasn't a stretch to suggest that this Gatsby character makes his wealth from a social media company. But where he really gets it, in the original text, he's a bootlegger. So I thought, what is a modern day bootlegger? And I thought the Silk Road, the dark web. And so all of these things were already there. So I really didn't have to go hunting too far.
Ayize, what about you with incorporating this sort of climate, planet, that kind of theme?
Yeah, I think it was there from the beginning. I think one of my taglines, to pitch it was what is the role of revenge on a dying planet? What's the role of one man's revenge on a dying planet? Right. And it's just that the dying planet is Earth, and so, like from the beginning, it's easy to be like, the world's coming to an end, we're all gonna die, we're gonna go in a giant ball of flame and it's gonna be gross. It's like, okay, cool, but how do we get there? Right? Like what does it look like right like before there? Like what are the signs? And so, I read one thing that was fascinating that was like, as it gets hotter, reptiles get larger and mammals get smaller. And so there's a race in the book where, two people are riding or have hitched these giant lizards, and then two people have hitched these small horses. And for me, that was like, okay, that's where we're at, right? Like it's beginning. It's the shifting is there, and energy plays a big role in this in terms of storing energy and all this stuff. So yeah, it was there absolutely from the beginning. I wanted the landscape and the surroundings to be a character as much as the Count or anybody else.
And then I want to touch on, since you've both written so much, published so much outside of these stories, what the difference, if there was a difference in creative process, was working from this as opposed to just creating from scratch. So Ayize, starting with you, did this present challenges that aren't there whenever you're just telling a wholly original story?
I think so. For me, leave me alone. Don't talk to me. Give me something to drink and 5 hours, and I will write a story. I'll just start going at it, and it may not be a great story, but it'll be a story. When it's somebody else's work, I feel like that, like I spent so much time just consuming it and figuring out like, I mean, you should see this copy of the Count of Monte Cristo that I have that's like so underlined and so, so like I went through and I like underlined everything I wanted and then like typed all of that out just to get a sense of like what I was doing, and then tried to put page numbers to each bit. And then and only then did I start writing the script. So totally different way to approach it as opposed to another story. But the payoff is that if I do it right and I describe it right, I got these awesome pages back from this artist that there's no freaking way I would have ever been able to do myself, and he added so much of his own style to it. I don't know if you've seen the book, but it's just gorgeous, it just looks beautiful, so there's that thing with collaboration where at some point you kind of have to let go and hope that other person picks up the baton and goes with it.
And I want to get back to that because I did want to ask you about the color, because the colors in it, like the reds and the blues, like Tristan's work is so unique. And I want to get back to the visual element too, but I want to hear from Jeremy about the differences between writing something from source material versus writing just a completely original story.
I actually find it a lot easier because there's already a framework. Gatsby has a clear framework that I worked off of, but I've also written a 2-book series focusing on Harry Houdini as a covert spy for the U.S. government, both as an adult and as a teenager. And so to dig up all this history and to kind of lay it out and see how it all plays out and see how my story can overlay that real history is a lot of fun for me. And I've also written a revisionist history of the band Nirvana as a book called Skip to the End, which is, in that book, music is a form of time travel, and it focuses on addiction in all its forms. So for me, it kind of reins me in because if I'm just left to my own devices, I can kind of go off in the deep end. However, when it comes to adapting something like these things that are well established, my one vice is that I can fall down research holes, and then sometimes it can be difficult to figure out what goes in, what stays out. But generally, I've found that it's in some ways easier to work off something that's already been established.
So let's talk about the visual component of it. So Ayize, I want to start with you because you had already started talking about Tristan and his work. So what were you trying to, like, whenever you wrote the script, what were you envisioning for the visuals, and what did your artist bring to it that you maybe weren't expecting?
I think my visual imagination kind of goes somewhere between Alex Ross and Bill Sienkiewicz, right? So it's like hyper realistic, and then like you're not sure what's happening, but there's motion involved, right? And so you can't capture that on the page. That's freaking crazy, right? So I try and be as clear as on the essentials as what I want for what I want on the page. An example being like at the start of everything, and I stole this from a writer, Nalo Hopkinson, who's a sci-fi writer. Actually, she's also written for comics as well. She's written for Vertigo. Nalo wrote at the top of one of her scripts, like, all, unless otherwise stated, all characters in this story need to be multiracial and with varying body sizes, right? So I kind of like stole that from her from the beginning, right? And then kind of laid out what I wanted. And then I knew a bit of Tristan's style, which is like, I call it Caribbean sunset meets manga, right? That like he just has this like insane color palette that's amazing, and has this like, and has this anatomy sense that's very Caribbean rooted, but like in terms of sequential storytelling, very manga-esque. So he knows what he's doing. And I again, kind of had to leave it to him. And what he brought back, what I didn't expect for him to bring back, were these vibrant, amazing colors. And the shapes of buildings and boats are very important in this, that while are realistic, also are just like filled with joie de vivre. I don't know, like everything looks alive. Oh, that's the other thing we talked about, was that like less atmosphere, brighter sun, different colors, right? So that inside and outside are gonna look drastically different, that like no one's outside without eye protection or head protection, right? So I can put that on the page, but for him to actually do it and to have a different shading and a different color palette for things that are happening inside and things that are happening outside also was like, power is at a premium. And so people don't just have lights on, right? Every light has a dual function. So if there's like a monitor, the monitor is also lighting the entire room. So then it just washes the whole room in a light green monitor thing. I'm like, dude, like I can't even think like that, you know what I mean? So it was absolutely beautiful to get his pages back, being like, and he's like, "What do you think?" I'm like, "I think you're beautiful. I think this is amazing." You know.
I love that. Jeremy, what about you? What was the visual impetus behind what you were writing, and how did the art come back? And what was the whole impulse
Sure.
behind it?
Felipe was an artist that he and I had collaborated on a short story, like a 10-page comic book for an anthology that has yet to see the light of day. Uh, but I kept up with him over the years, and I just saw that he was leveling up every time I saw new pages that he was working on for whatever project. And when it came around to start looking for a collaborator, I knew he could draw all the details I needed, because since this is placed in a very real, very present day Long Island, I needed everything to look exactly the way it's supposed to. Like a Range Rover needs to look like a Range Rover, an iPhone needs to look like an iPhone. If I'm going to design this elaborate Gatsby party and create a party for, people now that, could go to an event and see something you'll never see anywhere else, I needed someone who could draw all of that detail. And he went above and beyond, because in my scripts, I'm very direction focused. So I provide a plethora of reference images. But even with those images, he took them and, like, yeah, there might be a reference of a house, but he, you know, blew it out and like designed trees and like foliage and the sky and how clouds looked. And so for a book like Gatsby, I needed someone that could pay attention to all the detail and not skimp on backgrounds.
I love it. All right, so let's talk about the business side of it. I always do this part last because I like talking about the creative more, but the business side is important too. So I want to talk about each of your journeys with this particular project, why you went the route that you did, where it ended up, and any challenges that came along the way. So Jeremy, you're the Gatsby is out with AWA. What made you go this route? What made it the right home for it? Any hiccups along the way? That kind of stuff.
Oh, all the hiccups. What I've come to realize is that you don't really get to pick your publisher. That's the thing, is that I had written it as a prose novel. I was with an agent years ago who really wasn't serving me that well. And when I delivered the manuscript, he was so harsh about it that I actually quit writing for a year.
Oh wow.
And so I wasn't sure what to do, because I didn't want to lose an agent, didn't want to lose representation. He was my first and only agent, but I had gotten so much advice from other novelist friends who were like, you got to think of it as an abusive relationship. And I was like, okay. And so I got out, and then I decided to do the query letter because I found that agent through essentially a friend. And so I had never done the gauntlet of querying, and I finally did. And that's when I decided to adapt it into a graphic novel. And trying to tailor a query letter for a graphic novel is very difficult, because nobody is looking for that type of submission. And it was hard enough to find even one agent at an agency that would look at graphic novels. But miraculously, within 6 weeks of that, I was able to land an agent. However, she is primarily a children's book author. So trying to get this adult themed book out there really was outside her wheelhouse. So after about a year and a half, I just assumed it was dead. And I had pitched it independently to comic book publishers. Nobody was interested. And so it wasn't until, I guess, 3 years after starting work on it initially, Axel Alonso, who is, former editor-in-chief of Marvel, worked at Vertigo. I've known of him for a very long time. He had reached out to me personally about my image book made in Korea, and he exchanged information with me, like phone numbers. So he calls me, and he just happened to call me at my grandmother's funeral. He didn't know this, obviously, but I was like, oh my God, it's Axel Alonso. I can't not take this call. So I excused myself, which I felt really bad about. And we talked for like almost 2 hours in a parking lot. I was in the parking lot. And by the end of it, he said, what are you working on? And I said, I got this thing nobody wants. And I sent it to him. And a month later, he's like, this is what we want to do. So it was sort of like Hail Mary kind of thing. I'd really just given up on it. So again, I didn't really get to pick, but I'm glad that, they went with it, because they backed it in such a way that I don't think a lot of other publishers would have the time and resources. And you really just need one person in your corner.
A lot of good stuff there I want to get back to. But Ayize, let me hear from you too. What was the journey like getting this one out there? You went Abrams Books, I believe. What made that the right place? All those good things.
Yeah. Well, I don't have an agent. I've never had an agent. So I've done it all myself. No, I had an agent, but she didn't do much for me. So I just, like, it was weird, um,
Yeah.
but I knew, like I said, I knew John Jennings, and John had been talking to me about an imprint that he was getting going at Abrams called Megascope that focused primarily on underrepresented folks. And so, he's my friend. So I'm like, yeah, man, good job. Keep going, da da da. And I think the first one they did was with a friend of mine, David Brain. John wrote the script, but it was a Nnedi Okorafor short story that they turned into a graphic novel. And I was like, yeah, go for it. So then John, came to me on this one, and I was like, yeah, this is my first commissioned work. I usually write the story. I usually do the whole thing myself and then shop it around. But this one, got an advance and everything. It wasn't a big advance, but it was an advance. I was like, yay. You know, and it was good. It was fine. It was smooth. I think the only issue, just for like, writers out there, and I hope everybody understands the way a lot of people break down your payments, which is, you get a third when you sign the contract, you get a third when you deliver, and you get a third when they publish. There can be a big gap between when you deliver and when they read.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and it was a while, and I think it was like right as the pandemic hit too. And I was like, like, come on, man. I'd like worked my ass off for it, because I don't know what they would have done if I didn't deliver on time, but like I deliver on time. I think I delivered a little early even. And I was just like waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. And I was like, the fuck? And I keep like writing. So I don't know if I can swear on here.
You can.
Okay. So I was like, what the? No, I'm joking. I was asking like all the time. I was asking him all the time. I was just like, can you just, did you like it? Like if you didn't like it, like let me know and maybe I can do something else with it. And then finally they wrote back and they're like, this is one of the best scripts we've read, period. And I was like, oh, okay. Now pay me. Right. And that took a little. I think that's just publishing in general,
Yeah.
which is why it's good to have a day job. Um, but yeah, other than that, it was smooth like butter all the way through.
Hmm. Interesting. I want to also, it's a little off topic, but we are running out of time and I have way too many questions and I really wanted to get to this one. So I think one thing writers struggle with a lot, especially when they're newer, all throughout the process, is when to stand up for yourself and when to tell. Like, it sounds like you both had to do that in one capacity or another. Like Ayize, you're talking about how, trying to get the payment to come through. And Jeremy, you mentioned having to break up with an agent. Like, how do you know? And I know there's no catch-all answer for this, but how did you know that it's okay to stand up for yourself, that you're not doing anything that's gonna, backlash at you? Ayize, let's start with you.
I mean, I could get backlash. I don't know. What comes to mind is this whole like untouchable Dalit thing that I've been talking about in the book. They asked for a foreword for the book, and so I wrote about it. So I wrote it, and I wrote specifically about this Dalit thing. And what I got back was like, we don't want to touch that. And I don't know if it's like kind of a big deal. Like, there's like Dalit discrimination in like California at like .coms and at like different like tech companies and whatever. And it's all stuff. And they're just like, yeah, we really don't want to, get into that. And on one level, I'm like, no, I don't get it. I don't get it. I'll be honest. I'm like, I was gonna give him grace. I'm like, no, that's not like it's discrimination. It's discrimination based on color. That's wrong. Like, but the part I didn't understand, I'm like, it's already in the book. Like it's like at a core of like, well, like, so why can't we just talk about it? And they're like, oh well, no, and it's not the forward isn't very well written either. And so I was like, okay. And they're like, well, can you write another one? And I was like, no. Like, you asked for something, I gave it to you. You didn't like it. You don't have to like it, but I don't have to do something else. And they're like, okay, well, we're gonna pull pieces together from other stuff. I'm like, go right ahead. Like, I'm not mad about it, but I feel like you kind of have to. I don't care how much they're paying you, it's not worth your soul. So like if it impacts your soul, if you're feeling like you're not gonna be able to, rest with yourself at night, I wouldn't do it. But that's
Actually,
me.
I love that's one of the best like short answers I've seen. If it's gonna mess with your soul, don't do it. I think that's a very good way to look at it. Jeremy, I want to hear from you.
That's essentially, I will totally piggyback off of that. The things that are coming to mind from my own lived experiences, I have a rom-com graphic novel called Virtually Yours that came out through Dark Horse a year ago now. And that was originally going to be in a romantic anthology called Fresh Romance that ended up getting absorbed by another publisher. So I was kind of passed off to a new editorial team, which, that happens from time to time. But what I'd set out to write was just this fun, lighthearted rom-com because I also love that genre. I wanted to write just kind of fanfic almost, a love letter to that genre. And the editor wanted something more in depth, something, as she put it, a dissertation on love. And I said, I have 40 pages here. That's what I was originally contracted to write. You want a 200-page book that I don't have. Sorry, I'm not going to do that. But I will, to the credit of that editor, that those notes sat with me. And I decided, this was in 2017 when I realized all my stories pre-2017 were white male savior stories. And as a Korean adoptee raised by white people, I've had to come to terms with my own colorblindness, about white exceptionalism that I've been raised within, and just embracing my Asianness. So I took that story, which was an entirely white cast, and I diversified it. And from there, the story took on a completely different meaning. Characters were interacting in a completely different way. And it gave me this inspiration to look at all my work moving forward to literally and figuratively infuse color. So for me, it's just trying to write as authentically as possible. And if someone is trying to interfere with that authenticity, then it's very easy for me to say no, thank you.
I love that. And then last, I think we have time for one more question here. Another businessy related question is I often hear agents, editors alike saying, what is your brand as a writer? And it always drives me nuts because I don't like that question, but it might just be a personal thing. So I'm curious to hear from both you, if you feel like you have a brand, if you feel like you created that brand, or if it kind of made itself. Jeremy, let's start with you.
I don't think I have a brand. I think I just specifically didn't want to pigeonhole my career in a genre, which I think is very easy to do. And every project I work on, I want to tackle a completely different topic and a completely different genre if possible. But I guess my brand now is just telling authentic stories, providing proper representation. The advice that I would hear for years, and every writer's heard this, is write what you know. And I never liked that advice because it assumes that what I know is interesting, and I never assumed what I knew was interesting. So years of therapy and unpacking that statement, I came to unpack it, and what works for me is write what I've survived. So by writing pieces of myself, whether it's thoughts, feelings, trauma, you are writing from a place of authenticity, which I've come to realize those things in those stories are the things that editors and readers will reach out to me about because it resonated with them. So I have the fortune, I think any writer has the fortune of weaving their personal problems into a piece of fiction, but it can be very cathartic.
Ayize, what about you? Do you feel like you have a brand? Do you feel like writers need a brand?
I mean, I think that's something that the marketing team comes up with, and half the time they give you your brand.
Yeah.
I think like the commitment that I've made for myself, just because I find it boring, is like I don't want to write trauma porn. Like I don't want to write, I was a poor Black child growing up in the main streets. I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in those characters. There's probably other people that can write that better. I like to write about things that excite me, things that confuse me, things that are curious, and things that like motivate me. Like that's what I come from, and it looks like lots of different things. 4-book, Liminal People series, which is at one point science fiction, at one point Western, at one point fantasy, at one point who knows what. Box of Bones is this freaking, Tales from the Crypt meets Black History. Last Count of Monte Cristo, probably like the first official Afrofuturist thing that I've written. Next thing that's coming is this like, 60s African American magic users in Northern California going against like a preacher pimp. Like, I don't like, you tell me what that genre is, I will put my brand on it. In the meantime, I want the freedom to be able to write the X-Men, like I said, but also to like, I don't know, write a romance comedy set in a boarding school in New Hampshire between like a freaking Palestinian immigrant and a like African American kid on basketball scholarship, right? Because I went to boarding school in New Hampshire. You know what I mean? It's like, thank you, right? And like, I don't think what I've written like before or after should influence how someone receives that work, right? Like each work stands on its own. So I don't know how to do that, but that's what I'm working on.
I've never been asked that question either, about my brand. I think that if I look at all my work, the theme of identity run through all of it. So I suppose that might be my brand as, a identical triplet, transracial adoptee, non-binary person. It's like I am, identity crisis personified. So it's like that is really kind of, if I had to label a brand, it would be about identity.
One reason I leave that question in is because I like the responses. It's either people who are like, I know exactly what I do, or it's people who are like, you don't need that. And I love the multitude of responses I get from that. So we're just about out of time, but before I ask you to promote things, I'm just curious, since the subject of the day is retellings, if either of you have eyes on any other retellings, or if this was your one and done. Jeremy, what about you?
Developing a Romeo and Juliet story.
Ayize, how about you?
Yeah.
I have this idea. I'll just ruin it now, but hopefully it'll happen. All this multiversal shit that goes on in comics, right? So what's the universe where like all of the X-Men are black? And then what happens when they come to like this universe and they're like having to deal with like racial politics along with mutant politics, right? Like I want the X-Men to go back to that, like, again, Chris Claremont, I love him. Like, why? Well, because he put a Kenyan, a Canadian, a German, and a Russian, and two white people and a Japanese dude all on the same team and say work together, and they couldn't. Do you know what I mean? Like it's like that, like that kind of tension, that kind of like dynamism. I feel like there's not a lot of room for that conversation in comics right now, that everything has to be okay. So what happens when you have these folks who are like, okay, I guess there's white people in this universe, I'm not sure, but our Black Magneto is still coming and he's still gonna fuck everything up. So what are we gonna do, guys? Can you help us out? You know what I mean? Like I'd love to have that narrative, that dialogue go through.
I need both of these retellings, so I hope you both do it. So before we go, I do want to give you a chance to promote. If you have books handy, where can people find you online, social media, everything you want to throw out there? Ayize, let's start with you.
Okay. So the book I've been talking about, is it still blurry? God damn it. I'm gonna just...
We will also include links to all of these books in the show notes. So there it is.
There you go. Last Count of Monte Cristo, just talking about those beautiful pages. Look at that beautiful page. Look at it. Look at it. You can get it wherever you get your fine books. And then there's also Box of Bones, book 1. Like I said, Black History meets Tales from the Crypt. Definite horror book, not for the children. Second volume is coming out October 3rd. The Liminal People books are out. You can get them wherever you find all your great books. And if you want more about my writing career, AyizeJama-Everett.com. And you can find me on Instagram too, Ayize Jama-Everett.
Thank you. Jeremy, how about you?
Gatsby is out now. The amazing art, just super detailed. Durbo Kelly did the colors. Yep, this is through AWA Studios. You can get it wherever books are sold. My image series Made in Korea is also available. Virtually Yours through Dark Horse. And I'm on social media at Jeremy Holt Books, and my website's jeremyholtbooks.com.
I'm totally going to be following you, Jeremy, and I'm going to pick up all of your stuff. I'm really excited.
Likewise.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much for being here. I love talking about retellings. I love talking about all this stuff, and you both were excellent. I loved hearing about your process. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Happy to be here.
Appreciate it.
Introducing me to join work.
All right, to all our listeners, we're going to be back in 2 weeks. So keep an eye on negativespace.comics.com/events, and we'll see you next time.